Yeah, I think we did. Shockingly, I think we did. What I'd like to do is talk about how to do a literature search. And um, I thought we would do a couple exercises. One, to work on our own, paper topics. And then the other, to just do a little bit of a survey. So the thing that saddens me the most, chronic hunger in a world of plenty. Um, Also, the fact that Collaborate makes it a little bit harder to share files. I mean, I can throw files up on the screen, but what I want you to do while I'm talking, since you're all on the computer, is go into content and download the little how to do a literature search handout that I just posted. The second tragic part of the how to do a literature search handout is that the search engine that I use for all of my searches, that we've had at Queens College since I started working here, um, we just stopped subscribing to last year, which practically means that I really need to rewrite this little handout, which saddens me. I barely started rewriting it about an hour and a half ago. Um, but more practically, it means there's no ideal literature search engine. So while I'm going to throw up a screen, and while you guys are downloading that little how to do a literature search thing, let's just, um, so one search is a sort of useful feature that I pretty much never use because it searches, it's kind of like a Google search, but in the library, um, because it searches all sorts of literature, primary literature, secondary literature, magazines, movies, recorded speeches, all sorts of things at once. And for my line of work and the kinds of assignments and papers you're going to be writing in this and other science classes, you want to restrict your search to the primary literature. So, what's the primary literature? That is awesome. And there's interesting things. One, getting stuff from library staff and professionals is a great source and way to learn. Um, However, since they are generally interested in accessing many formats, basically, I bet they can make that one search sing in a way that I can't. So I will be talking about the search engines that I'm familiar with, um, and unfortunately that also means I'm going to talk about the ones that you have access to, because I don't think undergrads nor master students have access to the Minories library at the Graduate Center. Um, that's I actually talked to the librarian about that. So Dana's is on the right track, but I want to refine it. And actually, if you have the handout, it's going to be saying stuff. But primary literature is peer review publications of original research, right? So there's a bit of an ambiguity between primary literature and secondary literature. Um, because and the definition will be a little different, I don't know, for me versus um, what you might get in other courses, because I changed the definition to make it sort of a little more useful. And it's not just me, this is like most people in my field. So these are the results of experimental studies. um, you should see a white screen. Now you can see the text that I wrote. but I want to go in and write more in that text. Um, Secondary literature are reviews, and by now you should have the handout and you can see it's reviews of primary literature. And when I'm thinking about the secondary literature, I'm just looking at the peer-reviewed reviews. But what I was going to say is some fields include non-peer reviewed reviews as part of the secondary literature. And they might be things like encyclopedias that are still vetted for accuracy, even if they're not peer reviewed. So what's peer review? Um, does anyone know what peer review is? Um, well, they could be your friends, they could be your rivals or your enemies. Um, so yeah, I'll go with Adams a little bit more. Um, and I'll say so it's a formal process. Um, so when I write a paper, I do a study, analyze the data, write it up, and then I will send it in to a journal, and I'll have a little cover letter, and a journal will have several editors that specialize. Like if I'm sending it to Journal of Economic Entomology, I'll send it to someone who specializes in insecticide resistance rather than someone who's specializing in like pheromone traps or something. Um, Mostly because my last couple papers were on pesticide resistance. Anyway, I send it to the editor. The editor takes it, and they are supposed to be familiar with the field enough to identify um, practicing researchers on in the same field. And depending on the journal, I might be able to recommend reviewers or say I've or more importantly, say I've collaborated with these three people, so they shouldn't be reviewing my paper because we've actually worked together before and they're going to be positively biased. So I might identify people positively or negatively biased, but the editor is going to decide who to send it to. And this relates to like academia having at its base the same model as like medieval guilds, right? It's like a group of people who gradually accept new people into that field, and the group basically gets to decide not only sort of who's in, but also what counts as sort of useful, valid research. Um, and there's and so the reviewers will read the paper, hopefully, and they write comments and they have a rating system that'll be almost never do they say publish as written. Usually it'll either be these are the flaws or questions or problems, and this is how we'd like to see it revised, and then we'll read it again, or they'll say, you know, you'd need to do follow-up experiments to address these questions, or they might say it's just not appropriate for the journal, right? So most people get something between sort of 2 and 3. Um, so peer review, formal process, um, articles are submitted to an editor who sends them out for peer review to um, practicing researchers in the same field. comments, accept, review again with revisions, don't accept. Okay, and there we could spend a huge amount of time on the challenges facing peer review. There are so many, and they can be on different levels. Um, Peer review. So the, I mean, what are the one problem with peer review is actually just getting close reading and high quality reviews. And because there's so much sort of pressure to publish, an entire sort of parasitic industry of for-profit journals with very dubious peer review practices have cropped up, and every once in a while someone publishes a paper, submits a paper to one of these journals that is filled with like nonsense text, or no one is read the sentence, no one is reading this paper over and over again, and it gets accepted because the journals charge page charges afterwards. Um, so the Wakefield paper, I don't remember the details, although there have been several examples of fairly review in the Lancet, which I think is what published that paper, and it's since been retracted, but there you go. So one set of problems with peer review is occasionally just poor jobs by reviewers. Another problem with peer review is that in the most corrupt cases, authors that have a prior relationship with editors can submit to an editor that they know is sympathetic to them, and that will lead to the paper being published. And this is kind of the way that um, occasionally, like, climate change denial articles end up in genuine physics or geophysics journals, and it's always pretty amazing when that happens. Um, but I would say the um, the third like biggest problem with peer review, because the first two problems, I'm going to write some of these problems. Um, so peer review is actually really good at um, at judging like the interpretation of findings. It's really good at sort of placing a paper within a context, like, is this an important result? Peer review is not great at like catching fraud, like people making up data. The only thing that really catches fraud is other people trying to replicate studies and failing to. So that's a much slower process, and that happens in science too. So poor quality, superficial reviewers. Um, so another um, so those are problems, but those are more problems dealing with bad actors. There's a larger problem with peer review, even if we could solve um, the issues of, like, figuring out when people are making up their data, and people working with editors to get papers published without going through real peer review. The other problem with peer review is just that 2 to 4 reviewers isn't enough. It's just, and actually, there's some movement to have what's called either sort of group sourced peer review or post publication review. So, so a lot of times, there's not a corrupt process, but a kind of flawed paper gets through peer review because it's sent to two or three people and they weren't like really in tune. And then after the paper is published, lots of people point out the flaws in the study. And so I think one thing we should probably do is maybe move to different kinds of peer review. Oh, and I forgot the other peer review problem. Oh my goodness. The other problem with peer review is that um, is it's often subject to racial, sex, prestige, um, have all been shown in peer-reviewed studies to affect reviewer to affect reviews on papers and grant proposals. So I say prestige, I mean papers that come from well-established labs are reviewed more favorably. And this is a problem for which there actually is a solution, and some journals do this, and it's a good thing, which is um, blind um, reviews. So when I am sent a paper to review, the author knows who I am. However, some journals, I know who the author is. Other journals strip authorship from the paper and just send you the manuscript. The truth is, when you're in a field, you often can tell what lab is sending you the paper by the organism they're studying and the questions that they're studying. But a lot of times you can't. And so blind reviews, having the reviewers not know who the author is a great form that improves things. So I've been trashing peer review for 5 minutes now. But the other thing I want to point out is that the alternative to peer review, I mean, peer review has to be improved a great deal. And if we have both blind reviews and some intermediate stage of publication where review is open to the scientific community or the public at large, um, we'll have much better um, qualities of reviews and sort of better ways of rating publications. However, um, right now, and there are many journals that have blind reviews. In other words, um, so yeah, I mean there are also publications now like PLOS One where the downside is it has high page charges, but basically anyone can publish anything they want, and people interpret it that way, and the sort of evaluation of the paper happens after publication. Um, okay, so then the other problem is that everything else on the internet is basically unvetted and could be anything, right? So um, the alternatives to peer review actually are some of these more crowdsourced review systems. Although the problem with crowdsourced reviews that um, for sort of politicized subjects, it's gonna you know turn to crap as quickly as Facebook. Um, but for obscure topics, it's great because if just the 50 people who are really interested in that problem are reviewing manuscripts, that's going to be much, much better. For our purposes in doing these papers, if it's not peer reviewed, then the authors could be saying anything. And it is almost impossible to, basically, you can't use it as a citation um, of a result that has been vetted by anyone in the scientific community. So you want to be able to search the peer-reviewed literature. The sad thing is that the search engine that is really the the best, or at least the combination of best and easiest, Web of Science, we no longer have access to. So page 2 is the bottom of page 1 and page 2 in the handout is dead to us. And so I'm going to talk about 2 search engines. I'm going to talk about 3 that are between the 3 of them, you'll have either convenient searching tools, or you'll have uh, comprehensive completeness, but you can't have both of those at once. Science could. Web of Science would list approximately 10,000 peer-reviewed journals and has great search tools within it. Okay, so the 3 search engines that I'd like to the 3 search engines that I'd like us to focus on are Google Scholar, Elsevier Science Direct, and JSTOR. What are the advantages? Google Scholar is extremely wide-ranging. The downside is no guarantees of finding articles in QC accessible journals. And then the other problem is nothing special search tools. Elsevier Science Direct is it's from a private publisher, so basically it allows you to search mostly the journals that Elsevier publishes, and it's a big publisher, but there are lots of obvious ones that it doesn't. So no, nothing from Nature, Science, PNAS, Proc D. However, the nice thing about Elsevier is that it's got within its so the nice thing about Elsevier is that it's got good modern search tools. So you can do things especially like find articles that cite the article that you're looking at. And that's kind of one of the most important search tools for like expanding your search. JSTOR has only a small number of journals, but great coverage in time. So the nice thing about JSTOR is that you can assess whether people's views on a topic have changed over several decades. So that's the great thing about JSTOR. Okay, so I'd like I'd like us to look at all three of these journals. And so the way I think we should do that is by first I'm going to share application screen. Come on. Um, Fascinating. Sorry, I wanted to do, oh, let's do a Chrome tab. So the exercise that, okay, I'm gonna go back here. Okay, so I'm sharing the right screen. So in the handout, I said I wanted us to find a specific paper on clutch size in birds because I thought that would be a fun exercise in and um, it works well for Web of Science. However, um, it does not work well. It does not work well for Elsevier because doesn't um, Elsevier um, doesn't publish the American Naturalist, which this paper comes from. So what I'd like, let's go back. I'm going to do a search for clutch size and birds. Interestingly, we're going to do clutch size and birds. Couldn't because of a system problem. Con! I'm going to close that window. I'm going to go back here. I'm going to share a different window. I'm sorry. Okay. We're in the library now. And I went to find databases. And because I wanted Elsevier, Science Direct, I looked at E and then realized it's not there. And then I found Science Direct under S. Am I faculty? Yes, I am. And here we go. Now, what I want to search for, this is, you can search by individual journals, and that's not super helpful. So if we go into advanced search, we're now going to look for articles. Yeah, you still just see that. I'm so sorry. Thank you so much for sending that text. I'm going to stop sharing this. I'm going to go to the tab that actually has the Science Direct search. Thank you. I can hear the beeps, or you're welcome to unmute yourself because when I'm in another screen, I won't see the chat. So I'm going to do a search, clutch size bird. 5,661 results. Interestingly, I wonder if it matters whether I use clutch size in bird or birds. No. If I do clutch size in bird, no, it's the same. So Science Direct is is a little bit simpler than it'll search for, it will look at your search terms and like add other possible and other possible suffixes. Yeah, so ornithology is the field that would where people would worry about clutch size, the number of eggs that birds lay at one time. Now, there's a whole bunch of articles here. Let's say I wanted to specifically find that article and I saw on the slide that it said Liu 1993. So if I did that, LIOU, and I know that the year is 1993, and um, it couldn't find anything. Is that because I looked at the word wrong? No, no, it's not. It's because Elsevier Science Direct doesn't access the American Naturalist. So we'll take a look in Google Scholar. I'm going to move over and share a different board. And if I do search clutch size, first of all, if I do clutch size birds, you get 136,000 articles. So that's interesting. If I do clutch size LIOU 1993, I get my one article. And that's great. Note that it's in the American Naturalist. And the problem uh, with Google Scholar is it's actually super powerful. You just have to do the next step, which is to go and find the article. And so I'm going to go change my screen again, stop sharing that. We have to go back from databases and we have to go and find e-journals. And the truth is, in this case, one search probably would have worked. That's an interesting experiment. I have to find the journal. Ooh, that's not the American Naturalist. I'm not sure. Is it Hathi? Interesting publisher. Um, so it's found in JSTOR from 1867 until 1922. That's not super helpful. EBSCO from 1997, and so we're in trouble. It's falling in that unfortunate period where yeah, we can't find this article here. So then you'd then need to do oh, that saddens me. So we then need to go back into our Google search, see what happens when we click on it, and or write to me, because I will have access to some journals that you don't have access to through the Grad Center or through colleagues. And then the last sad thing I'm going to mention about this is that I would also recommend going on to ResearchGate, because that is a source where you can often find people's own copies of papers. So I'm going to share. Whoops. Um, go back to Google Scholar. We're back in Google Scholar. Just curious what happens when we click on it. We're not going to have access to the University of Chicago Press. We're just going to, when I click PDF, it's going to say you don't have access. So that saddens me. Okay, let's go back to Elsevier Science Direct. The reason why um, it is a yes, interlibrary loan can make things happen, and um, you know that shouldn't be your first. You only do that after you've exhausted whether or not the college has access to the journal. I'm actually so curious. I'm going to go back to the library itself, um, which is over here. Go back to the library. Let's see what happens when we do a one search. I don't think it's going to work, but um, it's given us 83 results. Fascinating. Yes, I was going to use filters on the side. So if you can actually unmute yourself and try voice, if that's if you're okay with that, just because I'm not going to be able to hear, I'm not going to be able to see stuff in chat, and then it takes some time. So interestingly, in the American Naturalist, it's not, even though we've limited it to the journal where we know that paper is. What we're finding are later papers that cite Lou 1993. Fascinating. Um, okay. Um, that was an interesting exercise. Okay. Um, let's assume that we're doing a simpler search and we are just interested in why birds lay the number of eggs that they do. And we're determined this time to use Science Direct. And we have, oh, we don't want it to be 1993. So we find a book, an article here, and it's unclear exactly how it's been sorted. Like, why is this our first, the first article that they're giving us? However, Trends in Ecology and Evolution is a fairly prestigious journal that prints reviews, right? So this is going to be usually a secondary literature article, although sometimes the analyses in the papers might make it original enough to be considered primary literature. It's kind of operates in the in between primary and secondary, but always peer reviewed. What I am not seeing, it's from 1997, page 443. Um, it's not actually giving me much of anything useful. So weird. Great. Uh, it let me, so interesting. Um, it let me download the PDF, but which is somewhere else, but it's not giving me any of the really useful tools um, to, it's not giving me any of the useful tools to use this article to find others. In other words, so I'm gonna stop sharing this little guy. I'm gonna share one more. Okay. one of the most powerful things that you can do once you've found one article relevant, and apparently you sometimes can do that in Elsevier Science Direct, but not always, because we just didn't in that example. But you can in Google Scholar is you can find how many other articles cite this one article that you're interested in. And that's why one of the most efficient um, strategies for doing a search is you search widely for just one article. And once you find one that is really on the topic you're interested in, um, you're going to be able to find out all the articles that cite that article. And then you're going to find out, like, what were the follow-up studies and who else, what did other people think of this study? Did they agree with it or not agree? And so then in Google Scholar, you can see all the articles that cited Liu et al. In this case, and on the to the right of each source, if there's a freely available um, copy of that paper um, outside of Queens College, it'll let you know. However, um, oftentimes what when you find an article, you will actually be able to find it in at Queens College. So, for example, um, we have one that's in the journal Ecology. Here's one that's in Oikos. Will estimates of lifetime recruitment of breeding offspring on small scale study plots help us to quantify processes underlying adaptation? Um, and um, that is in Oikos. And we can go back to the library. I'm going to try staying in one window. And then we can go find the journal and we type oikos, which means, Danish for house. Um, and um, we want oikos from 1999. Um, it's physically um, in the library, interestingly. And it's available from Wiley Online Library from 2000 on. Con! So that's amazingly frustrating. Um, and what we're going to find out is that when we search oikos, um, it's it's not going to give it to us. We're going to have to find that article somewhere else. Okay, I am somewhat stymied and flummoxed, but I'd recommend starting with Google Scholar and then hunting down journals in the e-journals from the library. Sci-Hub. I haven't used Sci-Hub. I've used ResearchGate, academia.edu. I'm feeling like they're a little academia.edu is a little sketchy, um, although you can find a lot of PDFs. ResearchGate I like more because it's supposed to be authors posting their own works when they have permission to. Yeah, so we can try Sci-Hub. So what I'd like us to do, what I'd like you to do, is actually let's take 15 minutes um, to try to find um, papers on our own paper topic, right? Um, and um, so this is page 4. So we'll have, you can put a topic down. Presumably, hopefully, you already have some good ideas, and then let's do a search where we keep track of what search terms we used, and then how we refine the search, then what we found in either Google Scholar, Elsevier Science Direct, or finally JSTOR. So what I'd say is let's take um, let's take